So we're about to be listening into the discussion with Kara Alaimo and her book, Over the Influence, at Books and Books in Coral Gables, currently underway. This was recorded on April 29th, 2024, once again at Books and Books in Coral Gables, Miami. So let's take a listen into this discussion here.
About the social impact of social media and issues affecting women. A former communicator at the United Nations and in the Obama administration, she lives in New Jersey with her family. And we used to teach together at Hofstra University in New York. That's how I know her. And I'm very excited to be here. So I just want to jump right in with what motivated you to write this book.
There's this old saying that we write the books that we need to read. And so I was first motivated to write this book to try to figure out how I was going to handle the social media use of my own young daughters. You know, you have a young daughter as well. And after I finished the book, I went for a walk with my CNN opinion editor. And we basically had a laugh about how naive I had been to think that my biggest problem was going to be figuring out how to deal with my own daughter's use of social media. Because having researched this book, the shocking realization I came to that really wasn't in the original book proposal is that my biggest problem is that our daughters are going to live in the world that social networks have brought. And I think that what's happening on social media is making the offline world far more dangerous for women and girls. So I could throw out a number of examples from, the massive increase in domestic violence that's happened in recent years to a CDC report that was put out last year, which found a significant increase in the percentage of teen girls in the United States who said that they had been forced to have sex between the years 2011 and 2021, just as social networks were taking off. And I think as a communication professor, one thing I know is that there is a significant body of literature that tells us that witnessing acts of violence in media is associated with committing acts of violence. And so I'm really worried about all of the violence that people are seeing online that I think is encouraging people to abuse women and girls offline. And I think, 10 years ago, it was certainly the case that there was plenty of misogyny online, but I think it was more segregated to darker corners of the internet. And I think what we've seen happen subsequently is that it's gone mainstream. And so now it is a common part of youth culture on TikTok to joke about violently abusing women. And this is really unique compared to other forms of extremism in the sense that American teenagers are not generally on TikTok joking about, say, beheading people. And I think now we're starting to see the effects of this, the normalization of violence and abuse of women spread offline, and it's terrifying.
The statistic that really stopped me in my tracks was a third of girls, I think it was 13 to 17, had had contact with an adult. I don't know if they knew it unknowingly or knowing it, but a third of girls having contact with an adult.
That would be one of our daughters.
Right.
We have 3 daughters.
And it's like, how does that happen? Why does that happen exactly? It's kind of like the accidental exposure to porn at age 8.
It happens because, as John Haidt would say, we protect our kids in the offline world. We arguably overprotect them in the offline world. And then parents and educators and law enforcement and pretty much everyone in our society is failing girls online. And, tech companies more than anyone. Online dating apps will say, oh yes, like we know we have registered sex offenders using our sites. They're matching them women, potential victims. And we know that there are all of these predators online connecting with girls. And, often they'll lie about their identity, convince a girl to share one racy image by, trying to establish an emotional relationship. And then the next text that comes through is, Venmo me $25,000 in the next hour, or I'm putting this all over the internet. This is called sextortion, and it's just
I mean, and then you make the point, which maybe some of us, I had forgotten Mark Zuckerberg's history of, that the culture of the tech companies is actually a certain kind of, the disenchanted male, white male, I guess, who, what did you, he started his career, right, by taking photos of hacking women's
photos, yeah, like hacking into websites, taking unauthorized photos of women at Harvard and creating a site so that people could rank how hot they are. And if I understand correctly, he also wanted to make it possible to compare them with farm animals.
Interesting.
Which, pretty much says everything.
Yeah. And
about what came next.
Right. I mean, and that whole, that culture, I love how you hello Google, Instagram, and you footnoted each one individually. Like, they all have these cultures internally that are problematic. So what do we expect to, So, on that note, what advice do you offer parents?
How much time do you have? I think, every parent in America is trying to figure out how to deal with their kids' use of social media. And I will preface this by saying that, one, I've heard from so many parents in my audiences at book events across the country that their kids are on social networks much younger than they otherwise would have been because of the pandemic, which I understand. And second, I have 2 whole chapters in this book about how the world judges women unfairly. And so I'm not here to sit in this chair and say that parents are doing something wrong, or to tell parents that they've chosen the wrong age to let their kids use social networks or any of that, because they have the rest of the world to do that for them. But I do have some advice. And first, I think it's really important to talk to kids of all genders about why we should never judge people for their appearances. But this is particularly important. We know that girls are on the visually oriented platforms like Instagram. And one of the stories that I tell in my book is of a woman named Vivian who wrote to me after reading one of my CNN opinion columns and said, I got my eating disorder on Instagram. And she talked about how she was an early adopter of Instagram when it launched. She was 15 years old. She was into yoga. She posted a picture of herself doing a handstand. That was picked up by a so-called Fitspo, or fitness inspiration page, and she was sucked down this rabbit hole of toxic content. So we know that this happens to some girls, and I think it's incredibly important to talk about not judging anyone, including and especially ourselves, for our appearances. One woman I was in conversation with on this book tour, who I think is one of the most important feminists alive, is Kate Mann. Do you know her? She's a philosopher at Cornell, and her latest book that was published in January is about our society's fat phobia. But there's this moment in the book where she talks about taking out her phone, pulling up Instagram, sitting down with her young daughter, and pulling up pictures of people's bodies, people of all different ages and races and levels of ability and body sizes. And what she would say to her daughter is, I'm so glad they're here in the world with us. And I thought that was one of the most beautiful ways I've ever heard of teaching a kid that's how we look at other human beings, which is so important when they're on social networks. Obviously, we have to talk to kids about all of the dangers they could face online, sextortion, sexting, and why that's so dangerous. Kids could be prosecuted, in theory, for producing sex of themselves. And then I think, the number one piece of advice I have to parents is to not threaten to take kids' phones away ever, and to make sure your kids know that they can always come to you for help. Because if a girl is being sextorted, the most dangerous situation you could be in would be for her to not come to you, come to a trusted adult, because she's afraid of losing her phone.
Well, you also talk about having a group of parents that agree on age and all of that. What if you don't have that? What if they're looking at phones that other parents have? You just kind of gave advice for what to do, but
yeah, I think,
how do you create that community?
So I do think it helps to start when our daughters are young, and I know you and I are both in a place where it's not too late for this.
Yeah.
I'm already talking to the parents of my kids' friends about this, and we have to collectively agree not to allow our kids to use phones until a particular age. I say 16, which I know, I might as well be saying age 40. I said this to a New York Times reporter, and she actually threatened to put my daughter's 16th birthday on her calendar and follow up with me because
Oh, wow.
it sounds so far-fetched to think that I could do this. But the thing is that if none of her friends had phones, this would not be a problem, right? It's a collective action problem. Talking to schools, and I know you're a big advocate for this as well, right? But educating parents would be, I think, the key here. And, you know, it's tricky because once a few of my daughter's friends have phones, even if I don't give her one, I'm going to be fighting that battle every night, but two, she'll be exposed to it on the school bus or on play dates. So it really is important for us to, you know, agree on these things. And a lot of parents have asked me at these events, look, I know my daughter's eventually going to have a phone. She's going to have a phone soon. She's getting to that age. Do I really need to, like, have this argument with her every single day to hold off for another year? And I say, like, unfortunately, if you can, the answer is actually yes.
Yeah.
So there's very good research out of the UK which shows that when girls use social media more, when they're going through puberty, which for girls is around the age of 13, that is associated with lower life satisfaction a year later. And so that is a particularly sensitive time where a girl's brain is literally rewiring. And if you can keep her off social networks at least, through age 13 and 14, that can make an enormous difference.
Okay, so let's move on to influencers.
Oh boy.
And I, yeah.
Before you continue, just one question about that. Is that because of the science about the puberty? Is that one of the reasons why your recommended age for the use of the devices is 16? Because of the development period?
It is, and boys go through puberty a little bit later, so that's why 16 is such a good age. Look, there's no magic number. Right. Social media can be very harmful to a 16-year-old as well, but I think kids just aren't equipped when they're going through puberty, and that's also a time where, for girls in particular, their confidence is plummeting, they're becoming more focused on their bodies, relationships take on even more importance. We know that social media is difficult to handle as an adult, but now try being a vulnerable teenager, dealing with seeing that all of your friends are in the same place and you weren't invited, or dealing with online bullying. It's just too much to ask them to cope with.
Yeah. So I want to group influencers in with, as college professors, we've probably seen our students want to be either an influencer or a social media manager. Like, these are seen as very cool professions, and you actually talk about both of those as sort of being the pink collar ghetto of technological careers. Can you talk more about that and misperceptions that we have about each of them?
Yeah. So I think there's this perception that influencers earn their parents and probably their whole neighborhood and live these very glamorous lives. And that's why the majority of teenagers today want to be influencers. The reality is very different. So the vast majority of influencers are women, and the vast majority earn far below the federal poverty level. And a lot of these are women who I think 20 years ago would have been freelance writers, but now the money that used to go from advertisers to newspapers and magazines to allow them to pay people decent wages for writing articles instead goes to Facebook and Google.
Yeah.
And so it's harder to make money writing an article for a women's magazine or for the New York Times. And we know that there's so many mothers in particular who are looking for flexible jobs so that they can balance the expectation to pick up your kid in the middle of the afternoon when, if you have a corporate job, you're also expected to be at work. So they're looking for flexible work, they turn to influencing. And it's just not very glamorous at all. Brands try to exploit women by offering them a free product instead of payment for creating posts. And we all know that you can't pay your landlord with a pair of sneakers, right? But it's also the case that our society has very unfair expectations of influencers. And so, there's this expectation for them to project these perfect lives so that they can peddle products, because, as I say in the book, no one wants to buy a product so that you can look like a harried woman with misbehaved kids at a messy home, right? So they have to project these perfect lives. They're paid very little. The gap the pay gap between men and women who influence is significantly greater than the overall pay gap in the United States. And, you know, these women really struggle with all these expectations. I say in the book that, you know, the work they do is really the work of several people. So if they worked in the advertising industry, which is dominated by men, especially at the upper levels, you'd have a whole team of people getting props and writing scripts and shooting and editing video. But an influencer is one woman doing jobs of many people for very low pay. And then we got social media managers, and so many of my students want to go manage the social media accounts of brands. But in reality, so one scholar at Cornell University did a study where she read job descriptions for social media managers. And she found that they use feminized language. They're looking to hire women. They're looking for people who are collaborative and flexible and all the qualities that women are socialized to have in our society. And I think it's really interesting to look at the salary of a social media manager versus the salary of someone who works for a tech company, because we know tech companies are dominated by men. And on average, a social media manager makes about a third of the salary of someone who works in tech, even though they're doing arguably tech work. They're coding, they're doing search engine optimization, they're editing video, they're doing things that require tech skills, but I think because it's a job that, you know, is dominated by women, it just doesn't have the pay and prestige that it deserves.
Can I ask another question? So, if my memory serves me correctly, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, the average pay gap usually in the offline world is women earn 25% less. Is that something like that?
It's less than that. I want to say
77 cents on the dollar, is it still?
Yeah,
or did it go up to 80?
I think it's 84.
So between 16 to 20%, something like that, less then?
Yeah, I think it's 84 cents on the dollar, but that's a very imperfect number because there's huge variance in different industries.
And then you just mentioned that for the social media managers, they make about a third of what people make in the tech world. So technically, that would be like 33%.
Yes, but I wouldn't compare that number because they're in different industries. But I think the point is that they're doing remarkably similar work.
But a lot of work for a lot less pay. I actually just met somebody who retired from working for Forbes in the art department for many years, and that's a very difficult job. I can imagine having that, even though she had a support team. So I can imagine doing that for social media managing by yourself. It's very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, it is because of the way, again, our society judges women. And so you make one mistake, right, in a post, and you're the subject of memes, and the whole online world comes together to roast you. And one woman who I quoted in the book said she kind of like lived in a perpetual state of fear of making like a minor slip up, right, that would bring on the censure of the internet.
And lead to the flounce. All this lingo that I didn't know. So the flounce, do you know what that is? Apparently.
Well, you can look it up in Urban Dictionary, but it's a Victorian term, and the connotation is that the idea is that a woman is gathering up her petticoats and storming out of the room, right? So the idea is that this woman is, you know, overly emotional and overwrought. And this is the term that is applied to women now who flee social media because they're facing rape and death threats.
And publicly, they renounce it publicly.
Right, and then they flounced, right? So they've said, I've had enough, I'm shuttering my accounts, and that is, you know, the verb for that now is to flounce. So
I'm taking my petticoats.
and storming out. Right, so this is what's happening, right? Because tech companies allow people to abuse women on their platforms, and so what they're doing when they say they're promoting free speech is, of course, protecting the free speech of perpetrators and silencing the victims.
Okay, moving on to the sanctimony culture.
Oh boy.
And I love, again, the humor that you bring to the book, that in French, which I didn't know, only 1 to 2% of women give birth without epidurals, apparently. And in French, giving birth without an epidural, you say, is not called natural childbirth. It's called giving birth without an epidural. Like, don't romanticize this. So you talk about how much misinformation, and I would add guilt, right, is targeted specifically towards mothers in the sanctimony culture. Then also linking that to the problem of sharenting, which I think is also part of trying to create this image of our perfect children and our perfect families, and we overshare. Can you explain what that is and what we can do about it?
Yeah, so there is so much misinformation that is targeted to mothers on social media, and I feel like this is the one kind of fake news that no one's talking about. This is actually the sample chapter that sold my book to my publisher. It's called Misinformation for Mommies, and it looks at this idea of natural childbirth, right? And so it's this idea that women who have the privilege and the option of, delivering their babies in a hospital with a licensed physician are instead foregoing that, and increasingly, since social media took off, planning home births. And I'm not trying to hate on midwives here. I say in the book, the world needs more people who care about supporting women, but the data tell us that, babies are many, many more times more likely to die when delivered as part of planned home births than when delivered in hospitals. And also as part of natural childbirth, of course, women are expected to forego pain medication, despite the fact that no one tells men or asks men whether they're going to take the anesthesia when they have surgery, right? And, as I know from experience, epidurals are a safe, highly effective form of pain management during, the most excruciating medical experience of most women's lives. And so the idea on social media is you should have home births, you should not have epidurals, and if you don't follow these prescriptions, of course, you are a bad mother. And so I look at why this, I call it misinformation, is spreading. I'll acknowledge that we do have a couple of wonderful doctors in the audience, but I think that it is the case that there is a huge problem in this country in that doctors do not listen to women. So women are sharing these experiences. I experienced it myself when I delivered my first child. That's amazing. And the hospital where I delivered, tried to send me home like just before my daughter was born.
Because you weren't in labor. They were going to give you pain management.
No, they didn't want to give me that either.
Okay.
And as it turns out, I had a condition that went undiagnosed at the time. The treatment for it is pain management. It's pain medication, and they wanted to send me home just before my daughter was born. And so, I've experienced it myself, and part of the answer here, of course, is for there to be training in medical schools and PA schools and nursing programs about how to appreciate the pain of women, right, and to respond to women's complaints. And so I think part of it is that women are seeing all these stories shared on social media about these terrible experiences with the medical system and saying, I think I'm going to get my doula and midwife and just deliver at home and not be up against all this. Yeah. So all that is true, but it's not the right solution, right? The right solution is for doctors to listen to women. And then the sharenting comes in, right, where women are bragging on social media that they delivered their 11th child calmly in their bathtub at home, and went back to a beauty pageant the next day. I'm referring to, or the next week. But sharenting is this desire to post about your kids on social media. And I spoke at the World Economic Forum, and the woman I was in conversation with said, "But I've seen you post pictures of your kids on social media." And I said, "Yes, because we're friends."
I've seen yours too.
There you go. And same response. So, again, I understand the imperative, and I actually think it's beautiful that my daughters have this community of people all over the world that are cousins in Sicily are watching my daughters grow up, right? And they have this community of friends and family all over the world who are connected to them, even though we rarely see each other. But I do think it's really important for parents to think twice about posting publicly, when you're not approving who is seeing those photos. And there have been all of that media coverage lately of, parents who run Instagram accounts with pictures of their kids that are followed by pedophiles.
Yeah. And I love the example you give of this gentleman here who's delivered babies and says, I would never do it at home, even though I've done it, right? That it just brings it home when an emergency room doctor says, look, I would never do this. It's kind of throwing, in the face of all of this misinformation, an image that's like real,
Yeah, and I think it's so sad that women are falling for this information on social media, because of course the answer, like the radical advice I offer in my book is like, if you have a medical question, call your doctor, call your pediatrician, right? Don't get your health information on social media. And so this is just the start of so much misinformation about medical things that we find on social media, all of the anti-vax stuff, all of the stuff that specifically targeted to mothers, telling mothers not to vaccinate our children. And as I write, if you are a parent and you don't want your child to die, getting them vaccinated is arguably the most effective thing you can do. And so, what's particularly disturbing is that so many of these messages are crafted to prey on women's vulnerabilities.
Yeah. But even that, the fact that you took us back to the origins of that, I didn't know it's in the back of my mind that, some people believe this, but I'm not really sure why they believe it. But telling us that this was actually started and propagated by 12 people, basically, and here's how it started by this piece of misinformation that got amplified. That was fascinating.
Yeah, and the doctor who published this, as a mom, this story just really stuck out to me, that the doctor who published this original study had invited his kids' friends to a birthday party and taken their blood. So that, I think, pretty much sums up like the medical ethics under which this story emerged, right? That autism was linked to vaccines, and I don't say in the book, but I have children in my family, not my own children, who are very, very dear to me, who have autism, and it's, it makes it even more sad and disturbing that there are people out there, trying to say that this is related to childhood vaccines. We know that autism, unfortunately, develops in utero long before they get their vaccines. There's a lot we don't know about autism, but pretty much the one thing everyone's certain about is that it doesn't come from vaccines. But you've got people who are making an awful lot of money convincing parents, to buy these essential oils to solve their problems. And, as I write in the book, everyone knows that a mother will do anything to help her children, anything to help a sick child.
Right. And so the medical journal that this was first published in it took 12 years for them to retract it. So by then, the damage was done, right? Incredible. I learned so much from this book. So moving on to professional women, who try to use social media unsuccessfully, because I have very few followers, I think, even though I have 4 books. And, you say that professional women often end up with fewer followers, reposts, and opportunities than men. Why is this? And what I didn't know was 20% of Wikipedia bios, only 20% are of women.
And that's an increase from a few years ago, by the way.
So how come I have a Wikipedia, but I don't have any followers?
Do you have a bio on Wikipedia?
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
We'll have to talk about that later.
Yeah, I don't know how this happened, but I don't have any followers. And then you also point out that 70% of employers use social media profiles to screen candidates. So where does that leave us if we're not looking like we're highly visible or successful in that digital space?
Yeah. So I actually wasn't aware of this research until I started working on this book, but when women share their professional expertise on social networks, they often end up with fewer followers, fewer reposts, fewer resulting opportunities than the men in their fields. And this is, I hope, a crazy idea, but I did an event recently with an attorney who handles cases of cyber sexual exploitation. And she opened the event by saying, "What is up with you? When I post about any other event," because she does loads of events, "I get way more engagement. And all of a sudden, I post about this event that's critical of social media companies and I'm not getting any visibility." And I thought that was fascinating. So, but, the problem is that there's no way to dispel this idea, right? That social networks don't show you content they don't want you to see because they're so, they're not transparent, right, about how their algorithms work, which is a big part of the story.
Yeah.
But the other big part of it, of course, is just old-fashioned offline bias, right, which is that when people picture an expert, when people picture a doctor, they picture a white man. And so people don't picture women as experts and therefore don't turn to women for expertise. And I have to say, so many women have walked out of my book events and said to me, "You've scared the daylights out of me. I'm so worried for myself. I'm so worried for my daughters." And I say, good, like I want you to be. But also, like, there's a message of hope here. So here's a place where we could change this overnight. And the answer is just to follow more women. And for all of us to amplify the posts of women. I feel so strongly about this that I actually created a list of feminists to follow on my website. You don't have to follow them, they're just the tip of the iceberg, but the point is they're this diverse, amazing group of women doing incredible things in lots of different fields. But if everyone who came to one of my book events followed 10 more women, that would start to solve the problem. It really would. And then, again, amplifying that content. And it is particularly problematic because employers look to our social profiles when they're making hiring decisions. The other thing that's really disturbing to me is I talk about one study that found that when prospective employers Google candidates, they judge male candidates for what they write, and they judge women candidates for, I'm sure you can all finish the sentence,
how they look.
which is how they look.
Say it together now. But, I just lost my thought. Something I was going to say about that. Anyway,
Well, I guess it goes without saying, too, that if you're going to follow more women, it shouldn't be the ones who are taking off all their clothes and showing their bust then, right? It's based on the merit of what they're writing and producing, right?
Yes, that's a complicated question
Because,
because part of it is that when women join social networks, one of the first things they learn really as girls is that sexualizing themselves is the easiest way to rack up likes.
Because I know a friend in Mexico I've been following for years, and she's a musician, and one of the things that she complained about years ago was how so many women are getting attention based off of them showing their bodies. And then just recently, I don't know if it was the end of last year, this year, now I see her hardly wearing any clothes and showing off because, I guess she buckled under the pressure, or sold out to that behavior.
I think it's easy to say that, but then we have to take account of that woman's life circumstances, right? So I tell the story of this one influencer in Pakistan who did just that because that was how she developed a social media following. Well, she had done that because she had left an abusive husband who I think used to stuff out cigarettes on her body and just do horrific things. Her way out, right, was she escaped to a women's shelter with her child. She ended up supporting herself and her parents by influencing. And yes, the way you get attention and the way you get likes and ultimately make money is by sexualizing yourself. What other options did this woman have, right? And so I think it's really just important to, when we look at influencers or when we look at women doing particular things on social media, understand the context in which they have been incentivized or our society has asked or expected them to do those things.
Yeah, and those are extreme examples. I think in our small circles, in our families and social circles, it's really important to talk to girls and young women about exactly what, look, I'm looking at your account right now. I'm going to like the ones that show you, like you said, a musician, show you playing the guitar, and here's why. Because the ones like that aren't showing off your talents. I'm saying this because I know of someone who I feel this way about. She has professional videos and images, and then she has the, but those are constant. And I see, look, you're trying to make your way in this field, in this career. I'm going to like these, but I'm not going to like these.
And along with that, I think it's a really good idea to sit down with your kids and look at content, period, at healthy content. Because again, I've spoken to so many parents who will tell me, I can't help my kids because I don't know how TikTok works and I can't create a TikTok myself. And I say, ask your child to take out TikTok, right? What kid is going to say no? And search for content that aligns with their interests. And that's a way of teaching a kid to use social networks to find healthy information. But also, it programs the algorithm. It sends a signal to the algorithm that your kid is interested in that. So then even when you're not together, that kid is likely to see more such content on the For You page.
But not until they're 16. Right. Because if you start showing, then they're going to want it.
And hopefully TikTok won't exist in the United States by then.
Yeah, so, fingers. So We already talked about the hate and abuse online and how it's making the offline world less safe for women, and you those very common statistics that we don't even know how prevalent this is because only 31% of sexual assaults are even reported. So we don't even have, I think, accurate numbers to tell us how much hate is being generated and how much violence. So I know it sounds trite, but what can we do about that?
So first of all, I would love for the United States to start keeping statistics about how many violent crimes are tied to dating apps. I think it's awfully convenient for these companies that is not happening right now. But more broadly, and obviously this is why kids don't belong on social networks. According to the FBI, most predators are going after kids who are 15 and under on social networks, which is another reason to start at 16. But more broadly, I think it is important for all of us to rethink what we do when we witness this kind of misogyny online. And let me just say, because it has become so common, it is likely that almost all of us, or perhaps all of us in this room, know someone personally offline who is sharing this content. I can tell you that I do. Someone who's related to me by marriage, generally speaking, not through my husband's family. But I think it's really important to think carefully about how we respond to it. And so I know I'm often tempted to respond to these posts. And I say that's generally a really bad idea because, again, it sends a signal to algorithms that people like it and want to see more of it. Instead, if we know the person offline, you have that conversation. You call them in, as the writer Ross would say, for a respectful offline conversation about why you're troubled with their content. You socially stigmatize it. I think it's really important to report this kind of content to social networks. And most of the time, tech companies are famous for either not responding to these reports or for responding and writing back to women and saying, no, that rape threat you received did not violate our terms of service.
Right.
But the point is that if we all did more of it, it would send a very powerful message to social networks that we demand that they stop. I think positive slamming is another really important thing. So if a woman's being abused online, she probably doesn't want you to give that abuse higher profile by tweeting about it. But instead, you could post something positive about something that she's done in her career or otherwise to try to boost her in other ways. And then, obviously, law enforcement and tech companies have huge roles to play. I have this nifty idea in the book that, obviously the FBI needs a massive increase in resources to investigate this kind of online violence and a mandate to do so. And there's a very simple way to fund that, which is with a tax on social networks.
Well, my favorite parts of the book, actually, I love the whole thing, but I really love when you bring it back to the importance of community and face-to-face. And I tweeted today, I posted that quote from 151. Can I read this?
Yeah.
It's actually a quote from a psychotherapist in New York. I forgot her name. Autumn?
Yeah.
She says, community is not a luxury. It is a necessity for us to feel happy and healthy. Flat out, hands down, period. Seeing people face to face keeps us physically and mentally healthy. It gives us a sense of purpose and belonging and allows us to help others, which is so healthy for us. We need to feed that. And then I'll come back to it on your last page to close, that concept from, I think this is from Linda Sarsour, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and she sort of brings that back again, and she says, the reason I have empathy for people in other communities is because I have people from these communities who I love. I've been to their homes. I've broken bread with them. I know their children. Getting to know people is something we've lost because of social media. Everyone is behind a screen. We need to meet people, get coffee, listen to their story, and that's how you build relationships. I just love that to close.
And I should say, Linda Sarsour is this, Palestinian activist who's going to meet her Jewish neighbors for coffee. Yeah. She's pretty incredible.
Yeah.
I love that way of closing. I'd say, Marisa Franco says that we're living in a time of friendship famine. It is now more common in this country to be disconnected than to be connected to other people. And what we all need is not 5,000 friends on Facebook. It's 2 people we can call at the end of a really bad day. And so, you can nurture that with, messages on Facebook Messenger or whatever it is. But it's just really important that we...
And you write that loneliness has surged since 2012, which we kind of know, but exactly when social media took off.
Yep.
That's just one effect, right? And there's, about this from media studies. Is it called the Potter? No. What is it called? The 150 people that our brain can cognitively hold, right?
So it's this idea that our brain can't conceive of large numbers of people, right? And it goes back to the fact that our ancestors didn't encounter large numbers of people.
And the natural number of the human brain in even hunter-gatherer societies and Christmas card lists and all that is 150. And
which I think is how many people we invited to our wedding.
And so this idea that, we're not really friending people, we're just
you can't
collecting.
Keep up relationships with all of these people, right?
Right.
And I won't say there are never, negative effects, right? It's helpful to have loose connections. For all sorts of reasons, some of my loose connections have shown up in conversation with me on this book tour, women that I didn't know in person, but sort of connected with. But what we actually need in friendships are more important for our health than diet and exercise, right? And what we need is just a couple people. Great to have more, but like a couple really good friendships are all we need to keep us healthy. And it gets messy after that, right? Like I'm thinking of Malcolm Gladwell's piece in the New Yorker many moons ago, that your loose connections are not the people you like risk your life with. It's not the people you like show up at, lunch counters with to risk your life and to protest. It's those 150 people. Yeah,
I mean, so you tie it into this concept that friending can also be, especially for teens and young people, a competitive practice to, together with all of those addictive kind of effects and behaviors. And so they're competing for something that doesn't actually benefit them because it's isolating them even more from, real world friendships.
And in some ways it's very dangerous, right? The teen girls I interviewed told me, well, like if some older guy asks to follow me, I'm going to be really intrigued by who he is and I'm going to be really flattered. And there you go. You can finish that story.
So, that's all I have. Did you want to add anything to this?
Just that I'd encourage everyone to follow more women, to amplify posts about issues you care about, and to rethink what you do when you witness hate online. And obviously I've got huge demands for lawmakers and tech companies in this book, so every chapter ends with a section called What We Can Do About It. But ultimately I do want us all to remember that there's plenty we can do as individuals.
All right, thank you so much.
Can I ask you a couple questions?
Yeah.
So I have not read your book yet, but I have a couple questions. First of all, I think it's ironic that, you talk about a sense of community, that these chairs are empty at a talk where you're talking about social media. And I wonder how many people who are not sitting in these chairs right now are home on social media, not in a sense of community, but we all do it. We're just disconnected because we're on. I mean, I'm not on social media, but people we're disconnected just in general. We're spending so much time online on the community computer. But my question is, first of all, I really like the title of your book. I think it's very clever, although I'm not sure I understand it. So can you put the title in a sentence for me?
Oh boy, this was very fraught because I had a different title
that
I quite liked. So what we're over, what we're done with is the influence of social media in our lives. And what I want people to know, and I hope becomes clear obviously from reading the book, is that I'm not hating on influencers themselves here. So I try to contextualize influencers as women who are up against very difficult challenges in our society, right? Trying to have flexible work, not getting paid well by brands, having all of these ugly expectations from their followers and from brands. And so what we're over is the influence of social media on our lives, and not necessarily influencers themselves who can do positive work.
What was your title?
This Feed is on Fire.
Ooh.
This has grown on me.
Yeah.
You know,
I like
publishing
that.
is never it's a messy process.
Yes, it is. And was this your choice of cover, or was that a battle too?
Indeed, it was not.
Okay.
How long do you have?
The short version of the story is that the cover, the initial design of this cover, had very big hands on it. And although I don't address it in the book, one thing we know is that the iPhone was designed for the palm of a man's hand. Of course, it's too big for the palm of a woman's hand, and that's why I was outraged by these big hands, because those were not the hands of a woman with an iPhone.
You've heard a lot about this. I take it.
Oh boy. And of course, my agent at UTA said the problem is not that this lecture you're giving. The problem is it's bad design. And nevertheless, we ended up here. But well, it's yellow like yours, which is at the cover of your book, which is very positive. But I do think it stands out on a bookshelf, which is positive.
I have a question also about, you were saying we're always on our phones, and I struggle with the fact that we adults and parents and professionals are on our phones for all of these mandatory reasons.
Yes.
And my daughter is seeing me constantly on my phone, so I feel the need to explain to her, I'm just taking her to the parking, or I'm ordering your lunches. I don't want her to feel like I'm doing something else and she's not a part of it, so I'm constantly telling her, this is to buy your friend's birthday present. But she's still seeing me constantly.
Well, I guess, I'm probably the oldest person in the room, but this gives you a sense of how out of touch I am. Because this sort of speaks to a place. You talk about the phone. So I still use my phone primarily. I do have an iPhone. I don't have a flip phone, so I guess I'm sort of with that. But I use my phone for making phone calls.
Phenomenal. That's the healthiest way.
Okay.
Call your friends.
And if I want to go online, and if I want to do social, if I want to do anything, I will use my computer, my laptop, or my iPad. But I don't walk around all day long using my phone. So when you're talking about, I guess the world now is like everybody's just, when you say phone, I'm getting confused because I'm thinking phone is like talking to people on the phone. You're saying phone, so when you said, I want my daughter can get a phone at 16, at age 16. I'm thinking, but kids now, when they go to kindergarten, they're given a phone in case there's an emergency.
Yes.
Yeah.
But when you're talking about a phone, when you're saying phones, you're talking about a phone with apps
social
on
media.
it,
That's what I'm
social
talking
media
about.
phones,
You're
not
right.
just because you hear parents say, my kid's leaving the house, he's going to preschool, kindergarten. They need to have a phone in case there's an emergency. You're not talking about that kind of.
Right. So I do not want my daughters on social media until age 16. I am fine with my daughters having a flip phone, and a lot of schools are now talking about taking phones away, and I think if they're going to take phones away, they should also take guns away from people. Because I have to say, I spent 5 hours under my desk at my university recently, and it was very comforting to me to in fact have a phone and have some connection with the outside world, and I would want my daughters to have that in the same situation, obviously. And so I would like to get my daughters a flip phone, right, so that we can communicate with one another. And I think that's a healthy form of connection. But now we've got, you have time. I know you, when we have a conversation, you're not looking at apps on your phone, right? And so you have time online, and then you have time where you're disconnected. But teenagers today are almost always on their phones using apps. And when they are not on those apps, they're still thinking about the drama that ensued on them. And so they almost never have a break from them, and a lot of adults as well. Yeah. I think this is a big parenting strategy that is discussed now, right? This idea, at least tell your child, I am paying our bills so that we will have electricity, and isn't it great that we have electricity in our home, etc.
Because I want to ask you if you needed to park out here, and you don't have the app in your phone.
No. I do use the phone for certain mandatory things.
Right.
So if I have to, I use the phone for that. But I don't
that's phenomenal.
And that's wonderful. And my point is the world is making so many things, more things mandatory.
On
That,
apps.
like, I can't order her lunches without being on my phone.
I'm
I can't,
required.
you know.
I'm required to have a messaging app for doctor-to-doctor communication.
I mean, I just read, I use it more than I'm saying
And
that
you
I
would like to,
use it,
yeah.
but
which can be useful, but very annoying at times
Very
too.
annoying to constantly be, and you know, doctors' offices want you to fill everything out on your phone before you come in, and I refuse. I'll come in, I'll fill it out when I'm there, when I'm, you know. And I heard this older gentleman arguing with the receptionist. He said, "But that's your job. Why am I having to do all of this on my phone? Give me the forms and tell me what you need." And you know, it's almost, it's a cultural battle that they're forcing us to be staring at this thing for every single minutia of, you know.
That's how, you know, notifications come to us from our children's school, right?
Right.
You have to have certain apps.
But can you say to children, yes, you can have mandatory things, but no, you can't have Instagram on your phone. No, you can't have Facebook on your phone. No, you can't have TikTok on your phone. Because those things are not, I don't think those are things mandatory that you need in life to get through life. Whereas the things that you need, you need. So, I don't know, can you say no to these things? Or
So what happens in practical reality is that parents often tell their kids you can't have Instagram, and there's a tool that allows kids to make Instagram look like a calculator. So they put the calculator on their like, you know, as an app on the first, you know, screen that they're seeing on their phone, and it's Instagram, and their parents don't know. So the answer is just that kids find ways around, we know this, around their parents' rules.
You know, one of the things, because you guys keep using the word phone all the time, is I actually really make a very clear distinction talking about the difference between a phone, like a flip phone, and I say mobile device. Because there really is a clear distinction in my mind. I don't like using the word phone for this thing. You know what I mean? I always say mobile device because it really separates the fact that this is really a computer we're traveling around with as opposed to just a phone. So I actually, sometimes when people say, "Are you on your phone?" I'm like, "No, I'm on a mobile device." You know, this thing is completely different than just a phone. So I don't know. That's just something.
And you talk about the tracking devices and all kinds of, you know, information that they're getting from us just by walking around with our phones. So I think that's appropriate to say it's much more than a phone.
And also, you know, he was saying earlier about, you know, the people that showed up here and most people are just at home. What do you also think about the fact that more men came to talk about a book about women and girls?
No, I've been so delighted. I have been floored at a lot of my events. I have boys and men, and they're a huge part of the solution. And so I'm delighted to see boys and men in my audiences. But I'll say, you know, it's a Monday night.
Yeah.
You know, moms have extracurricular activities with their kids. I know as a mom it is incredibly hard for me to get to events on a weeknight or really ever. And so I understand all of these things, and you know, I'll go to my first book event was at Yeshiva University. I thought, will anyone come? There wasn't an empty seat in the auditorium. 122 girls showed up for this talk. And so, you know, I will acknowledge that people often show up and want to have this conversation, and it can be tricky for many reasons.
Yeah.
Are you aware of any books out there that talk about the influence of social media on boys?
So
boys?
John Haidt's book has a chapter about boys, and the answer is just that the data is much more confusing and it's not as bad. And so for girls, this huge mental health crisis happened around 2010. All of the data is clear, and it's because girls are more concerned with their appearances, girls get more judgments online, girls are more relational, girls spend more time online. Boys spend their time watching porn and playing video games. It's unfortunate that they're watching porn because they're not out actually developing, like learning how to talk to girls, right? And like developing those skills. And the video games, like the data is showing, like often are not as awful as we think. But what Haidt says is that it's just an opportunity cost. You know, when a boy spends 40 or 50 hours a week playing video games, it's all the other things he could have been doing at that time. But boys just have not experienced this same level of massive decline in mental health that started around 2010 with this certain version of the iPhone when everyone started using apps. And so I will acknowledge it can be frustrating. You know, John's book has been #1 and #2 on the New York Times bestseller list. And, I read the New York Times review of his book, and, the reviewer said, well, the problem here is, he's looking at all kids, and this is a problem among girls in rich countries. Hello, I wrote that book.
I mean, there is that research about gaming when it's the mass. What is it called? Those
multi-level player games.
That boys are getting seriously addicted when it's the multi-level,
yes.
Especially in particular. So there's different kinds of risks for them, and then losing sleep because the other players are in other countries and other time zones, and they feel like they have to keep up, and so there's other kinds of issues. But like eating disorders, that's for us.
And largely the sexual predators and the body image stuff, and just the fact that girls are spending so much more time online.
Yeah. So on that happy note,
Thank you. I found that particularly interesting that 150 names in someone's head.
Is what we can keep track
right,
of.
no,
I thought
so Kim Kardashian doesn't actually know the 363 million people that follow her. I can't even imagine that. I mean, it's unimaginable numbers. I mean, 10 is too much for me. So just wait. In 20 years, we'll have this like heads-up display on a contact lens, and the device will be in your brain.
And now she's having
it's
her
part of the
kids.
society.
Is it her that's having her kids become influencers for makeup for
Influencers,
other 8-year-olds to be wearing makeup?
Yes.
Like,
well, hopefully we can stop some of it, and I appreciate it.
really?
Listen, we have the books for sale behind the counter. Both of the authors' books are for sale behind the counter, so if you want to get a book signed, please buy it up there.
All right, so you just listened to the recording of Kara Alaimo's discussion with Kristal Brent Zook at Books and Books in Coral Gables. This is World Reading Club. I'm Hakeem Alipokus Alexander, and you can see some more information and a photo drop on worldreadingclub.com. And once again, the book is Over the Influence with Kara Alaimo at Books and Books in Coral Gables, Miami. It was a discussion between her, Kristal Brent, and of course I asked a few questions, and some other folks in the audience did as well. On worldreadingclub.com, you'll find links to her books as well as for her moderator, Kristal Brent Zook. Until next time.